Hello, ladies. We are in week 9 of our Gospel of Mark study. This week we'll be looking at Mark chapter 6, verses 1 through 52. Not quite the whole chapter, but almost. If you haven't had a chance to read it, please do so now. Put me on pause and come back when you're done so you have the full context. This section has a few different passages in it, and they really show us a contrast of unbelief to what we saw before. We just finished reading about the bleeding woman and her great faith, Jairus' great faith in Jesus. And here we see a little bit of unbelief coming through and from various people. Now, there are lots and lots of different things to see in here, and I'm not saying it's all about unbelief, but there's a little portrait of it coming through in a few ways, and that's what I just want to highlight when I'm speaking now. So verses 1 through 6 of chapter 6, Jesus goes home. He goes to his hometown. And what does he do on Sabbath day? He goes to the synagogue and teaches, because that's what he always does, right? And while he's there, the people who listen were actually astonished, we're told, at his words. They're astonished by his miracles, and they really are just kind of flabbergasted by this. But then Mark tells us they kind of respond by saying, where did this man get these things? What is this wisdom to given to him? And such miracles as these performed by his hands. They're not actually saying that in like, wow. It seems more of a, oh, who is he? They say, it's just Mary and Joseph's son. We know his brothers and his sisters. And they took offense at Jesus. That's their response. It was offense. It was unbelief. It wasn't trust. It wasn't faith. They were offended by him, by who he was. And Jesus wonders at their unbelief. Another gospel writer says he marveled at their unbelief. He's just jaw drop. What? Well, in verse 5, Mark uses a phrase that sometimes confuses people. He says he could do no miracles there, except that he laid his hands upon a few sick people and healed them. And when we read he could not do miracles, we think, oh no, wait a minute. Why couldn't he? Was it because they didn't believe? Is it? Well, he was doing healing, right? The next phrase is, and he healed a lot of people. So obviously Jesus is capable of healing despite your faith or their faith or anyone's faith. And Jesus did many miracles that were completely unrelated to people's faith, right? I mean, he had helped the disciples in the storm, even though he says, you who have little faith, right? He had cast out demons galore and healed lots of people. He's about to feed 5,000 men plus some women and children. I don't think all of them believed, but he's going to do it anyway. So it's not as if Jesus can't heal if you don't have faith. But let's consider some of the mighty miracles, those big things that Jesus did. Remember back to chapter 2 when Jesus healed the paralytic who'd been paralyzed since birth. Jesus sees his faith and his friend's faith. He forgives him and rises him, cures him of his paralysis. Just last week, we read about the bleeding woman, and he says to her, your faith has made you well, right? He healed her, but he notices her faith. So what does Mark mean when he says he could do no miracles there? Well, they didn't believe, so they didn't ask. He couldn't do anything great. I mean, he healed people, which is pretty awesome anyway, but anything miraculous because they didn't ask. They didn't believe that he could. They didn't believe in him. They were offended by him. So why would they go ask him to do anything amazing? It's a lesson, I think, for us in this, ladies, that maybe Jesus doesn't do amazing things in our lives because we don't think he can. And we don't ask. Well, Jesus does what he always does. He goes to other villages and keeps teaching. He doesn't just quit. No one believed. No, he just goes to the next town and keeps teaching. Well, the next little vignette we see is really unusual, but he tells the disciples in twos, they haven't done this before, to go out into various villages and follow me, essentially there, right? Do what I have been doing. Do what I've taught you. Teach, just like I've been teaching. Heal. I'm giving you authority. You can heal and cast out demons. Don't bring anything with you. You don't need money. Just trust in my plan. Trust in God and go. Do what I've taught you to do. Here's where I see the unbelief. In verse 11, he says, and any place that does not receive you or listen to you. Jesus is telling them people aren't all going to believe you. They're not. And Jesus has just given them an example in his hometown of how do you respond when people don't believe you. You still do good, right? He still healed people from their illnesses. You still have compassion. And then, as he tells them here, shake the dust off the soles of your feet for a testimony against them. You don't even want to bring the dirt from your feet from that town with you, but then go to the next town. Keep teaching. Just go to the next people. Go to the next town. Lesson for us, right? When people don't believe, it doesn't mean we stop. We just go to the next town. We go to the next friend. We go to the next family member, and we speak truth of Jesus. Well, there's this interlude in here about King Herod and John the Baptist. And it seems like probably in this time, King Herod killed John the Baptist. And the story is all in there about why and how that happened. But Herod knew John the Baptist. He kind of liked him. He kept him alive, kept him safe. He was interested in him, but he didn't believe his words. He never repented. John called out him and his wife Herodias on their sinful relationship. And Herodias really did not like being called out in her sin. And so she orchestrates the death of John the Baptist. But Herod gives in because he doesn't believe. So when he hears about Jesus and the miracles and the teaching, he thinks it's John's ghost. John's come back from the dead, almost like to haunt me or to get even or something. And he's afraid of that. Well, it's interesting. Later, in Jesus' life, in Luke 23, verse 8, we get to the trials before Jesus' crucifixion, and Jesus comes actually before Herod. And it's been time, so Herod's got a slightly different attitude. Now, Herod was very glad when he saw Jesus, for he had wanted to see him for a long time because he had been hearing about him and was hoping to see some sign performed by him. Right? He wants to be entertained. He wants a miracle. He wants to see something neat. He doesn't believe in Jesus. And he allows Jesus to be put to death. And sadly, his unbelief leads even to his own spiritual eternal death. So unbelief, right? Jesus' hometown, and he departs from them doing not much because they didn't believe. The places that the disciples had visited who didn't believe, and they just wake the dust off their feet. And Herod and Herodias who don't believe and leave death in their wake. Well, this last episode of unbelief is probably the hardest, the saddest, because it's unbelief in the 12 disciples. We see here, they've just returned from having gone out and preached and healed and casting out demons. And it must have been a huge faith builder, you would think. And they want to talk about it. And Jesus wants to listen to them. He wants them to share all about it. He tells them, come away by yourselves to a lonely place and rest for a while. For there were many people coming and going, and they'd not even have time to eat. And they went away in a boat to a lonely place by themselves. Lessons, right? When you've done a lot, when you've been busy, when you've done ministry for days or weeks on end, you need to rest. You need to eat. You need to pray. You need to talk about what has happened, what you did well, what you didn't do well. You need to talk with Jesus about what's happened. And it's kind of funny. I like to say that the crowd followed him, but really the crowd got to the other side before they did. So I don't know if that's following or not, but the crowd shows up and Jesus sees the crowd. And we're told in verse 34, not surprising, he feels compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So what does he do? Teaches, because that's what he does. And I think there's a lesson in this for us too, ladies. We may have come off of a lot of activity, a lot of busyness, a lot of service, and we're tired and we want to sit down by ourselves and eat. But there are needs that jump in front of you, sometimes quite literally jump in front of you. And I hope that we respond with compassion and that we will meet needs, that we will teach, that we will feed, as Jesus does here, the people who need us. Well, the 12 see all of these people, and it's a lot, right? 5,000 men and untold numbers of women and children who would come with them. And the disciples just say, hey, we've got to send them away so they can go eat something. And Jesus says, will you feed them? And they are dumbfounded. We don't have that much money, right? They just got on these trips and Jesus said, don't bring any money with you. They've got nothing. And he says, well, what do you have? They've got 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. I don't think they were, fish and loaves, but even if they were, it was 5,000 men, so it wasn't going to be enough. And the disciples don't really believe that God's going to do much, but they still obey. And Jesus takes the fish and the loaves and blesses the food and gives thanks and breaks it. And the disciples pass it out. 5,000 men, women, and children, in addition. Everybody eats. 12 baskets left over. They had more food at the end of leftovers than they did with what they started. What a faith builder. I mean, come on. Jesus has command over the elements of food. He can multiply food. It's amazing. Well, Jesus tells the disciples to get in a boat and go to the other side, and he's going to stay behind and kind of finish up with people. And then, of course, the other thing he always likes to do, pray. I want to go alone. I need to pray. He departs, and after he bids everybody farewell, and the disciples are rowing across the lake. Well, we're told in Mark 14, 24 and 25, and then here, kind of what's going on here. We're told they're many stadia away from the land. A stadium is 600 feet, many stadia away. We don't know how many, but quite a few. So maybe half a mile away from shore. We don't know exactly. Jesus is going to go out and pass by them and just walk to the other side of the lake. That's his plan. He intended to just walk past him to the other side, but the wind had been contrary and the boat had been battered by waves. And so the disciples haven't really gotten very far. I mean, right, maybe a half a mile-ish that they've rowed. And we don't know precisely when they started, but right now it's the 4th watch, which means 3 to 6 a.m. I'm guessing they got in their boat when it was still light and they could see and where they were headed. They have really not gotten far. It's been a struggle over these hours that they've been rowing, and they see Jesus walking on the water and they freak. First thought, it's a ghost. This is the second time we've had people think it was a ghost, which is kind of funny. But they are frightened. Jesus says to them at the end of verse 50, "Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid." He didn't want them to just be afraid. He wanted to help them deal with that. And so he says, don't worry. Take courage. It's just I. It's just Jesus. It's okay. And he gets in the boat everything calms down, and they were greatly astonished. Whether it was over the wind and the waves, combined with Jesus walking on water, they're greatly astonished. That term means they were thrown out of position. It was like they'd been disconnected, thrown into a different position. Another way it could be described is they were out of their minds. Like maybe speechless, sort of. Just, what just happened here in a big way? It's interesting, though. Mark doesn't leave us with I wonder why they were so astonished, right? They'd seen Jesus calm down a sea, a worse storm. They'd just seen Jesus multiply food for maybe a family and feed 5,000 plus people. Why were they so greatly astonished? Look what Mark says in verse 52. For they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their heart was hardened. Oh, they had gained no insight from the loaves. That word insight is they hadn't put it together. Okay? They hadn't wisened up yet. They hadn't figured it out. They did not learn the lessons that Jesus has been teaching them all of these chapters of Mark so far. Okay? They're not learning. They don't get it. Why don't they get it? Because their heart was hardened. Okay? Calloused is another way to say it. They had a calloused heart. God has graciously been teaching them, and they are failing to learn. It's so sad. It reminds us that our experiences do not create a soft heart. Our experiences do not mean we will interpret them accurately. Okay? Often Jesus comments on their lack of faith, their lack of understanding. Okay? There's a lesson for this for us, ladies, that it needs to be heart first. Okay? Hearts first. We need to be careful of our hearts, right? We don't want to have the unbelief of Jesus's hometown where, oh, it's Jesus. It's no big deal. What? Why would Jesus say that? It's just Jesus. That we become so familiar with this name that it doesn't mean anything. Or like the cities that his disciples had preached at where they just want nothing to do with it. We don't want to have this unbelief that is so calloused and hard-hearted and not recognize the power and authority of Jesus. As just a little extra addendum at the end here, I think sometimes when you read this passage about Jesus walking on water, you may think, why didn't Mark talk about Peter, right? Peter walked on water with Jesus. Why didn't Mark bring that up? And often through the Gospels, when you read the different accounts, one writer will highlight this piece and one will highlight this. Sometimes they say the same parts and then they leave this thing out. And I think the reason Mark left Peter out of this was because he wanted us to see that all 12 of the disciples had not gained insight and had a hardened heart. If he had brought in Peter, we would have been looking at Peter and thinking about him. Well, did he have enough faith because he walked, but then he didn't? And our mind would maybe have been distracted by the one. And Mark here is focusing on the 12. All of them had hard hearts. So I hope you enjoy studying this week and enjoy the end of Mark.